All right, Chapter 5 on development through the lifespan. This is going to be a bit of a longer one, so I'm sorry about that, but this chapter just simply has a lot of content in it, so let's start learning it. All right, so this chapter focuses on the branch of developmental psychology, and this branch is going to study all the different types of changes that occur throughout the lifespan, like physical, cognitive, and social changes among people. And those key words for this branch of psychology are throughout the lifespan. We're measuring these changes from birth to death. And so there are kind of three major issues within developmental psychology, or three kind of debates. And the first of these is nature and nurture. This is asking the question of how much of our development is accounted for by our nature, our genetics, and how much is accounted for by our environment, nurture. And then there's the debate of continuity versus stages. What components of our development are gradual and continuous, that's the continuity side, and which components of our development happen abruptly in separate stages. Do you just wake up one day and all of a sudden you're a mature and moral person? Probably not. That's more of a continuity development issue. But in terms of stages, when a baby stands up to walk, that's a pretty abrupt stage change. Or a baby just begins to talk. There's not really continuity there. They are either talking or they're not. They're either walking or they're not, right? So that's kind of a stages issue. Changes that happen abruptly and in discrete stages or patterns. And then we've got stability and change. What components of our development are stable throughout time, and what components of our development are subject to change? Okay, you definitely want to know the order of prenatal development. So know that it goes zygote, embryo, fetus. Zygote, embryo, fetus. So the zygote is just the fertilized egg from conception to 2 weeks. So the zygote stage is very, very short. And recall too that when we were in chapter 4, we would talk about monozygotic and dizygotic twins. So a monozygotic twin, one zygote, is a twin whose zygote egg splits into two genetically identical pieces, versus a dizygotic twin, two zygotes, two separate eggs, fraternal twins. And then we've got embryo, which is from 2 weeks up to 9 weeks. In the embryonic stage, we do start to see the beginning of the development of the organs and a heartbeat as well. And then the fetal stage, or fetus, is from 9 weeks all the way up to birth. And then kind of the key point to be aware of within the fetus stage is in the sixth month, we have organs start to develop much more, and we reach something called the point of viability. And the point of viability is the point at which you could conceivably remove a fetus from its mother's womb and it would be able to survive on its own. Of course, we can't expect any infant to survive completely on their own. They still have to, be given food and, all those sorts of things. But the point of viability is the idea that the fetus no longer absolutely needs to be inside its mother's womb to survive. It can potentially come out and still live, even though it's very early, could still live, but just, obviously with outside help still. But its organs are developed enough to survive outside the womb. And then you definitely want to know what teratogons are. And a teratogen is absolutely anything that can harm a developing zygote, embryo, or fetus, that can harm a developing child. And so teratogons, typically we think of things like alcohol. Alcohol can cause fetal alcohol syndrome, which is a horrible syndrome that can happen to children whose mothers have drank during their pregnancy. And it causes all sorts of cognitive, developmental, learning disabilities, and other associated bodily changes. But we typically think of teratogons as something like alcohol, some kind of chemical that can harm a developing baby. But viruses are actually something that are counted as teratogons as well. And so if the mother contracts some kind of virus, that virus could potentially cross the barrier and harm the fetus as well. So teratogons are anything that can harm a developing fetus, whether that's chemical or otherwise. Okay, do have some idea about these inherent reflexes of newborns. The first is the pain reflex. We all have this, right? We withdraw our limbs if we feel pain. If you touch something hot, your hand jerks back. It's just a reflex, pain. And then the rooting reflex is that anytime something touches a baby's cheek, the baby will turn its head and open its mouth in order to feed. And this is adaptive for feeding, for eating, right, as a baby. The sucking response is also another response that's adaptive for feeding, and that's if something is placed inside of an infant's mouth, they're going to suck on it. Then we have the startle reflex, which is when an infant sprawls their arms and legs out, clenches their fists, and cries in response to being startled. And this is really also adaptive in the sense that it gets the attention of the mother. And then we've got the grasping reflex. This is a newborn's instinct to grasp tightly onto anything you place in its hand. And this is adaptive for staying close to their mother. Then we've got this concept of habituation. And habituation is really explained in these studies where we show children some kind of picture or something like that, and we just keep showing it to them over and over. And the more times that you show a child the same stimulus, the less they care about it, the less attention they pay to it, the more frequently they look away. And so this really just shows us some evidence that newborns do have the capacity for memory to some degree. So just be aware that habituation is essentially boredom. If you show a newborn the same stimulus over and over, they get less and less interested. And this shows us that to some degree, we at least can see some amount of short-term memory within newborns. And then even as newborns, we are drawn to social interaction from the start. Social interaction is something inherent to humans that we need to have. It is a basic need for humans to have some form of social interaction. And so even as newborns, we were drawn to social interaction from the start. Some examples: newborns turn their head towards the sound of human voices, but not towards other sounds. Newborns gaze longer at images that resemble faces than images that don't. And this one's kind of interesting to me. Newborns prefer to look at objects 8 to 12 inches away from them, which happens to be the same distance between a nursing infant's eyes and their mother's eyes. All right, when it comes to maturation, be aware that maturation is a nature issue, not a nurture issue. So maturation refers to only the biological growth processes that enable orderly changes in behavior that are uninfluenced by experience, relatively uninfluenced. Like I said before, it's always an interaction, but when we talk about maturation, we're talking about biological, genetic growth processes that are really not that affected by experience. Your experience in life is not going to determine what height you grow to, right? That's a maturation issue. Okay, and then when it comes to brain development in infants, when babies are born, they already have most of the brain cells that they're ever going to have. So this idea that we're born with very few brain cells and we grow a whole bunch of them throughout our life is really a false premise. When babies are born, they actually already have most of the brain cells they're ever going to have, but they use those brain cells in different ways to cultivate neural networks. So neural networks are what grow over time. But when babies are born, they have all of the brain cells they're ever going to have, but the pathways are then reinforced depending on how they use them. And then neural networks which originally formed in the womb begin to branch and enable infants to walk, talk, and remember. Rapid growth. This I don't know why this gets asked about all the time, but be aware that between the ages of 3 and 6, we see tremendous growth in the frontal lobes of infants. And then it kind of tapers off, and we don't see a lot of frontal lobe growth until, adolescence all the way up through early adulthood. But between the ages of 3 and 6, we just see an absolute boom in frontal lobe growth. And then the association areas, which remember when we talked about association areas in chapter 2, those are for higher level mental processes, so more complex, abstract thinking. Association areas are the last to develop. So just like we talked about way back in chapter 2, things that enable us to survive are the first to develop, and then those sort of ancillary things that we don't necessarily need, but they might help us, are last to develop. So when it comes to motor development in infants, motor development coincides with brain development. So that means that as we are developing our motor skills, our brain pathways are changing to accommodate for that development to happen. And this allows for us to have physical coordination, or for infants to begin to develop physical coordination at least. And then this point is really important. And so the first thing that I want you to write down on your worksheet for this chapter is that the sequence or the order of motor development is the same for everyone. The sequence or the order of motor development is the same for everyone, but the timing is not. Make sure you write that down. The sequence or the order of motor development is the same for everybody, but the timing is not. So what we mean by that is that the sequence of motor development, babies are going to roll over before they crawl, they're going to crawl before they walk, they're going to walk before they run. So the sequence in which physical or motor development occurs is the same sequence for everybody, but the time at which that happens for everybody is not the same. So, not every single baby is going to learn to roll over on their 36th day of life and learn to crawl on their 57th day of life, or, something along these lines. The timing is different for everybody, but the sequence, the order that these events occur in, is something that is universal, the same for everybody. And then most infants are ready to walk by about age 1. Okay. Remember, we have been talking about cognitive psychology and cognition. This is all about those mental processes. Okay, you definitely want to know these terms of schema, assimilation, and accommodation, and particularly this process of assimilation which leads to accommodation in children. So the idea here is that your schema is just sort of your concept or your understanding of something. Your schema is like a category, essentially. And so I might have a schema for farm animals, let's say, and things that fit into that schema would be like pigs and horses and sheep, right? All sorts of different farm animals. And so really in this chapter, we're kind of talking about how this applies to children. So children might have a schema for animals, but their schema is going to be pretty small because they don't have a lot of life experience yet. So if the only animal that they've ever had in their whole life was the cat that they had at home or the dog that they had at home, then that's all that their schema is going to be comprised of, is maybe cat and dog. And so the thing with assimilation, just start there. The thing with assimilation is it's much like how it sounds. Assimilate, similar, right? So assimilation is a mistake that a child makes when they don't understand that something new that they're witnessing or seeing is something different from what they've seen before. And so if, this child has only ever seen a cat and then they see, a horse, they might call the horse kitty, right? Because they don't know another word for it. In their schema of animals, all they have is a cat, right? So assimilation is a mistake. It's an error made by a child because they don't have any other knowledge to work off of. And so accommodation is fixing that error. Accommodation is the solution to the error of assimilation. So, once the child points to the horse and says kitty, their mom or dad says, no, that's not a kitty. That's actually a horse. It's a horsey, you know. And then they're like, oh, okay, that's a horse. Okay. And so they add that concept, that term of a horse into their schema. And so now their schema of animals has been accommodated or changed. And now they have, you know, in their schema, cat, dog, and horse, right? So definitely know how all three of those work together, because you'll for sure get a question that has to do with that. Okay, and then these 4 stages of cognitive development, you want to know these like the back of your hand. I promise you these are going to get asked about. And so you want to know, and you know, I always say if there's 4 things, that makes a great multiple choice question, right? So you want to know what happens in each of these stages, and also the key milestones that children should be reaching by the end of each of these stages. So the sensory motor stage is much like how it sounds. It's all about sensation and how we coordinate our motor movements to understand the sensations around us. And so this is between the ages of birth to 2 years old. And this is where infants only know and understand the world in terms of their sensory interpretations and motor activities. So all that they can do, because they don't have language, they don't have, you know, the ability to communicate, all that they can do to understand the world around them is touch stuff. And especially really small children, all they want to do is stick stuff in their mouths too. So that is all sensory motor stage. We are just touching, feeling, experiencing everything in the world around us. And so what you should reach by the end of the sensory motor stage, so by 2 years old, is this understanding of object permanence. So when you have a child who's really, really young, like below 2 years, if you take one of their toys and you cover it up with a blanket, they have no idea where that toy has gone. It's magic to them. They just have no clue what happened to it. And so object permanence is eventually reaching the understanding that even when you don't see something right in front of you, that thing hasn't stopped existing. So it's the awareness that things still do exist even if you can't see them, even if it's not, you know, within your lens to see that thing at this moment. That doesn't mean that it just evaporated into thin air. And then we've got the pre-operational stage, 2 to 6 to 7. Here we learn to use language, but we don't understand logic yet. Pre-operational is just language. And during the pre-operational stage, we see this egocentrism. And so that is the difficulty for a child to take on another's point of view. They are egocentric. They are centered on their own ego, on their own self, their own understanding, and they cannot take other people's points of view. And so by the end of pre-operational stage, they should go from egocentrism to reaching theory of mind. And theory of mind is gaining that awareness about other people's ideas, mental states, feelings, thoughts, those sorts of things. So at the start of pre-operational stage, you are egocentric. By the end, you should have some idea of theory of mind. Concrete operational stage, we can use concrete logic. So basic math, I mean, you probably remember age 7 to 11, you were learning basic logic, basic math at this stage. So concrete events are something that develop in the concrete operational stage. And by the end of the concrete operational stage, children should understand the concept of conservation. And this is like the idea that if I have, a tall, thin glass of milk and I pour it into a short, fat glass of milk, the way that the milk looks in each of those glasses is it looks different, but it's still the same amount. And so, when you pour the exact same amount of a liquid into 2 different looking glasses, the child should be able to identify that there's not more liquid in one glass versus the other. They should be able to identify that even though the form, the way that it looks has changed, the volume of the material has not changed. And then lastly, formal operational, we get abstract logic starting to develop. and that's 12 years and beyond. So we are all in the formal operational stage for the rest of our lives. So again, brief review. Sensory motor, we don't understand anything, no language, nothing. All we can do is just touch stuff and experience the world in terms of sensation. Pre-operational, language, no logic. And then the logic comes in the last two stages. In concrete operational, we have concrete logic and events. And in formal operational, now we reach the ability to think about things abstractly. Think about abstract ideas. Okay. Now, stranger anxiety is just something that every single infant experiences at about 8 months of age, where if you give that child to someone else, they start to freak out. And this is because they are so attached to their mother. And they fear, other people potentially taking them away or hurting them. They just don't trust people yet. So stranger anxiety is something everybody experiences. And then attachment, well, we need to see attachment develop in order for a child to grow and develop properly. If, there's unfortunately a lack of attachment or an insecure attachment where the caregiver is not consistent with the child, that can have very severe developmental impacts later. And so what we want children to develop is basic trust. And this is just a general sense that the world is predictable and trustworthy. It's not living in anxiety, essentially. Basic trust is just this sort of sense of well-being, that things are okay, that the people around you are looking out for you or taking care of you, you're not in any great danger. And this is supposedly formed by having a responsive caregiver who takes care of you and who, builds that trust for you. Then when it comes to self-concept, your self-concept is really just your understanding of yourself. If I asked you to describe who you are, you'll probably list some traits. I'm kind, I'm intelligent, I'm, these sorts of things. And so your self-concept is really just the way you think about yourself, the way you think and feel about yourself. Okay, the critical period. This is crucial. So critical periods are essentially a deadline to where a child has to be exposed to something in order to develop normally. So there's a critical period for language development, for example. And this is really why it's so much easier to learn a second language really, really young. And it gets harder and harder to do the older that you get because you've missed that critical period. But, it's far more severe if you miss the critical period for language development at all. So you never learn, how to communicate with others. There was this horrible case of a very neglected child named Jeannie who was locked inside of a cage in the basement of her parents' house. They had boarded up all the windows, and she had absolutely nothing except a little hole in her cage that they would slip food through and a toilet in the corner of her cage. And this child completely missed the critical period for language development, amongst other things. And she grew up having had no exposure to regular sights and sounds that other growing children would have exposure to. And then she was found several years later, and she's been in therapy for a long time now trying to learn how to communicate with others. But there is just a lack of neural space available for her to do that. And the longer that you go without using certain connections in your brain, like the ones that she would have used to develop an understanding of language, the longer that you go without using those connections, they go through a process called pruning, where your brain essentially just cuts off unused connections because they're not being used. So why do we need them there? So if you miss a critical period for something, that is really bad news for development. That's kind of the main takeaway. And then imprinting, you should think of imprinting as really quite the same idea as attachment. But imprinting is the process by which animals form attachments, whereas attachment is, the process by which human beings form attachments. Okay. So there's a couple experiments that are really famous, and these are two things: the Harlow monkeys and the strange situations experiments that you are definitely going to want to know about for this exam. So in the Harlow monkey experiments, the Harlows found that monkeys who were raised with artificial mothers. So let's pause there and talk a little bit about this study. So they gave these monkeys two, mothers, quote unquote, and one of them was made with cloth. So she was very soft. She was very, of course, this wasn't living. This was just like a little, almost like a monkey mannequin type situation. But they, wrapped her in cloth. And so she was very soft, she was very warm, she was kind of like a snuggly stuffed animal. And then the other mother that they gave to these monkeys was made out of wire. But the wire mother held the food bottle, the bottle that they fed from. So, the cloth mother was there to provide comfort, essentially, whereas the wire mother was there to provide actual nourishment. So what happened was the Harlows found that monkeys who were raised with artificial mothers, when they were afraid, they would blast noise at these monkeys and make them scared. When they were afraid, they would cling to their cloth mother, not to the wire mother holding the feeding bottle. And this finding is important because it shows that attachment doesn't just have to do with your basic biological needs being met. It's not just that, the wire mother had food, so we're going to trust her and attach to only her. No, it's about comfort too. It's about comfort, it's about trust, it's about sort of building that more intimate connection with something. And so previously we thought that infants were just becoming attached to their mothers because they fed them, they nourished them. But these studies show that monkeys form attachments to the mother that was more comforting to them, not just the mother who provided for their basic needs. And then the strange situations experiments. Mary Ainsworth put this together. And she would bring children and their mothers into a room, have the mothers get up and leave, and monitor the reactions of the children. So there's two types of attachment. The first is secure attachment. And so children who were securely attached, there's a few main points that you need to know about this. So a secure attachment, the signs that we see of secure attachment are, number one, that children go away from their mother when she's in the room and they comfortably explore and play in the world around them, in the environment around them. So, occasionally they'll look back and check, make sure she's still there, everything's fine, but they feel comfortable to get up and go off and explore. So that's the first thing. They explore their environment happily. The second thing is that once the mother leaves, they're distressed. That's a bother for them. They trust their mother, they want her around, they're attached to her, and so when she leaves, that's distressing for them. But as soon as she returns, this is the third thing, as soon as she returns, they seek contact with her and they are immediately consoled and happy that she's back. So you want to know those three things that have to do with secure attachment, that they roam around and explore their environment freely when the mother is there. They are distressed when the mother leaves, but then they seek contact with her and they are comforted when she returns. That is what defines a secure attachment. Okay, now the next thing that I want you to actually write down on your worksheet for me to look at is that insecure attachment has two different paths. Write that down, that there are two different paths for insecure attachment. The first path is emotional distress. The second path is indifference. So you can maybe write that and then draw a little branching diagram or something that says the first path is emotional distress. The second path is indifference. Okay. So when it comes to insecure attachment, children who are insecurely attached are usually anxious or avoidant of trusting people. And so, number one, unlike secure attachment, insecurely attached children are not going to explore the environment around them. Sometimes they cling really closely to their mother, or they're just sitting there alone and they don't care about what's going on around them. They're not exploring, though. They're not interested in the environment around them. And then when their mother leaves, now this is where we get the two paths. The first one is emotional distress. Their mother leaves, they cry and scream, and when she returns, they stay upset. Because a securely attached child will still be distressed when their mother leaves, but they'll be consoled when she comes back. So the first path of insecure attachment is they're crying and screaming, but they stay upset when she returns. Her presence coming back is not a comfort to them. And then the second path, like I said, is indifference. She leaves, they don't care. They hardly notice. She returns, still don't care, still hardly notice. So it's either emotional distress that persists even when she comes back, or complete indifference to her leaving and returning. Okay. There are 4 types of parenting styles, which again, great multiple choice test question, right? So be aware of these parenting styles. The first is authoritarian. Someone who is authoritarian is a because I said so parent. Someone who's authoritarian says, my house, my rules. I don't care how you feel about it. I don't care what you think is fair, but it's just all about me and my rules. It's because I said so. I demand obedience from my children if I'm an authoritarian parent. And the one that people, mix up the most frequently here is authoritarian and authoritative. So think of it like authoritarian, like an authoritarian government. You don't get a say. We make the choices for you. Whereas someone who's authoritative might be, a little bit dominant, a little bit, in charge, but they're still listening to the people around them. So you can be authoritative, and that's, sort of a good quality, but authoritarian is too far. So authoritarian parents don't really give justification for their rules. They're just saying, them's the rules because I say so. Permissive parents are, it's kind of like authoritarian too hot, permissive too cold, right? So permissive parents, they want their children to like them, and so they just give them everything. They don't make demands, they don't set boundaries or limits, they don't punish their kids, they just let them do whatever they want to do. And then negligent parents. Now, the difference between permissive and negligent is permissive parents are still involved in their children's lives. They still care about how their children view them and care about their relationship with their children. And part of the reason that permissive parents are giving, their children the option to do basically anything they want is because they think that it will make them like them more. And so permissive parents have a relationship with their children. It's just an unstructured relationship. Whereas negligent parents are uninvolved. They're uninvolved. So they're careless, they're inattentive, they're avoidant. They don't want to have a close relationship with their children. Whereas permissive parents, they let their children do whatever they want, but they still take care of their basic needs and they still want to cultivate a relationship with them. A negligent parent is not meeting the needs of the child in really any regard. And really, that's too why negligence is an actual criminal offense. And then authoritative. So this is really the happy medium that has the best outcomes for children. So an authoritative parent will be demanding and responsive. So they will have rules and expectations, but they give reasons for why those rules and expectations are in place. And beyond that, they're also open to hearing what their children have to say, and they'll allow exceptions to rules. So let's say the rule is curfew's 10 p.m., but the child says, hey, I want to go to a movie with my friend. It's going to end at 10:15. I'll be home by 10:30. Can I go? Is that okay? An authoritarian parent would say, no, curfew is 10 p.m. That's what it is. I don't care. But an authoritative parent would say, probably, oh, that's fine. That makes sense. Like, this is a special exception. No big deal. I hear you. Like, that's fair, So authoritative parents still have boundaries and rules, but they're open to having discussion with their children and listening to what their children have to say. Okay. Adolescence is that, well, basically adolescence is synonymous with teenage years. And so adolescence is that teenage period where you're entering puberty and starting to become more independent, transitioning really from child to adult, the in-between. Puberty is the time at which you become capable of reproducing, so where you reach sexual maturation. Your puberty is kind of the process of reaching that. When it comes to adolescent physical development, up until puberty, the brain cells have been increasing in their connections, and then during adolescence, the pruning process occurs. So this is where, and this is why, like I said, learning a second language is so hard after a certain point. This is that point, because the pruning process comes along and your brain just snips off all of those unused neurons and connections between them. So brain cells increase all the way up to adolescence, and then in adolescence, we prune away those unused connections, cut them away. Myelin starts to grow around the axons of neurons in the frontal lobes, which speeds along neurotransmission and enables better communication with other brain regions. So, I said there was rapid development in the frontal lobes between the ages of 3 and 6. Well, once we reach adolescence, we see that rapid development again. Not quite as rapid as between the ages of 3 and 6, but more so than in between these two stages. And so myelin starts to grow around the axons of neurons in the frontal lobes to enable quicker, better judgment and planning capability. The frontal lobe matures, judgment improves, impulse control and long-term planning are all affected positively. Okay, this is the next part of chapter 5. There is a whole lot in this chapter, not gonna lie to you. This is another thing that you'll for sure get asked a question about, Kohlberg's levels of moral thinking. So before we even go through these, this is the next thing I want you to write down on your worksheet. I should see this written on your worksheet. Next to pre-conventional, write down the word or the terms reward and punishment. Pre-conventional, reward, and punishment. Next to conventional, laws and rules. Pre-conventional, reward and punishment, conventional, laws and rules. And then post-conventional, next to that, write down your own ethics and morality. Your own ethics and morality. Okay, now let's put these pieces together. So morality is really what we're talking about here. Pre-conventional morality, your focus is on your self-interest. You are doing what is moral because it helps you to avoid punishment or gain rewards. So, your parents ground you if you don't share your toy with your friends. So you start to learn, oh, okay, well, if I'm going to get punished for, not doing this, then I better do it. It must be the right thing to do if I'm going to get rewarded for doing it and punished for not doing it. So, pre-conventional morality is based all on your self-interest, avoiding punishments, and getting rewards. Then you reach conventional morality in adolescence, and this is all about obeying laws and rules for the purpose of gaining social approval or maintaining social order. So, people in this stage, it's not really that they're acting morally because they think it's the right thing to do. It's still kind of like avoiding punishment and gaining rewards, but it's all about these laws and rules. That's where they're deriving their morality from. If the law says that I can't kill someone, well, then killing someone must be a bad thing to do, right? So they're gaining their understanding of morality through laws and rules made by authority figures, whether that's a teacher or parent or a coach or something like that. So it's all about fitting in, gaining social approval, and maintaining social order, not disrupting things for other people. And then finally, post-conventional. And post-conventional is what we really expect when we think of morality, and that's really just an understanding of basic rights and self-defined ethical principles. So when you reach post-conventional morality, it's all about your actual understanding of ethics and morality. So post-conventional morality is the stage in which you might actually go against a law or a rule if you think that that law or rule violates a moral principle of your own. So post-conventional morality is really kind of your own personal understanding of what is right and wrong. Okay, so again, pre-conventional morality, we are just trying to avoid punishment or gain rewards. It's all about reward and punishment. Conventional morality, we're just trying to follow the rules set in front of us, so upholding laws and rules so that we can fit in and gain approval and not, stand out as, for something bad, essentially. And then post-conventional morality, now we are developed enough to understand ethics and rights and just have our own sense of morality. Oftentimes when you see a multiple choice question on this, they'll give you 4 options of pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional, and unconventional morality. Unconventional is not real. They just use it as a distractor option. So just be aware of that. Okay. Identity is really just kind of your sense of who you are, right? And identity is the task of the adolescent. Identity is what we are striving to understand in ourselves during the period of adolescence. And then we have a social identity. So this is a little bit, identity and social identity is a little bit like individualistic versus collectivistic in a sense. And so social identity is the we aspect of our self-concept. Who am I in terms of the groups that I associate with? So, if I'm just answering the question, who am I alone? I might say things like I was mentioning before, I'm kind, I'm intelligent, whatever. But social identity is how you answer who you are in terms of your group memberships. So I am a psychology and neuroscience major. I'm not, but someone might say I'm a mother, or I'm, a wife, or I'm these sorts of things. Intimacy is the task of the young adult. Intimacy is really just about forming close, loving relationships. And I do want to make a point to say, too, that when we talk about intimacy in psychology, I think that intimacy tends to be very sexually connotated. People think that, we can only talk about intimacy in the sense of couples and, relationship bonds. And that's really just not the case. You can have an intimate relationship with anybody. Intimacy is just point blank closeness. It's just closeness with another person. So it doesn't have to be sexually connotated. Intimacy is just, finding and forming a close, loving relationship with anyone, friend, family member, boyfriend or girlfriend. And then there's this idea of emerging adulthood. Emerging adulthood is the in-between period where technically, legally, you're an adult, but you are not fully independent from your parents yet. So this is about age 18 to the mid-20s. We're all here at this stage right now. And in Western cultures, children are no longer adolescents. They're considered to be full adults, but they're not fully independent of their parents. They're still on their insurance plan. Their parents are still paying for their college, maybe, things along these lines. They're not fully independent, but legally they are termed an adult. And that is the stage of emerging adulthood. You are emerging into full adulthood. Okay. So you don't need to know these in and out. These get asked about less often than all of the other things we've covered here. But on your worksheet, I should see, this is the next thing, I want you to put stars or, bold or underline these or some other indicator. But I want you to put stars or something of that nature next to infancy, adolescence, young adulthood, and late adulthood. Infancy, adolescence, young adulthood, late adulthood. Those are the 4 that I see most frequently asked about. So you definitely want to know that in infancy is where we develop basic trust. That's really important that you know that basic trust is developed in infancy. And then in adolescence, know that the task of the adolescent is forming an identity. So you have to remember that identity goes with adolescence. And it makes some sense. I mean, in high school, we're all figuring out who we are, right? And if we don't figure that out, then we have, this idea of role confusion. That's what the central issue is here, identity versus role confusion. Either we figure out who we are, we find our identity, or we're confused about what our role is. We're confused about who we are. And then in young adulthood, the main task is intimacy. If you fail to find intimacy, you feel isolated, right? So adolescence, identity, young adulthood, intimacy. And then just know that in late adulthood is really where we kind of go back and have this analysis of how our life has gone, and if we're, if we feel a sense of integrity over the way that we've lived our lives, or if we feel a sense of despair. I didn't do enough. I didn't pursue my dreams. I didn't, foster a good enough relationship with my children, maybe. Those sorts of things. So late adulthood is really where we're looking back at all these years of our lives and thinking, did I do it right? Or did I mess something up? Did I miss something? Do I have regrets, essentially? Okay. This is just some summary of sort of the main changes that happen in each of these stages. So in early adulthood, we start to already see a decline mid-20s in muscular strength, reaction time, sensory keenness, and cardiac output. So really the main note to make here for early adulthood is a lot of stuff starts to decline this early. It's all downhill from here. And then middle adulthood, the main point that you want to write down for middle adulthood is that sexual activity decreases along with ability to reproduce. So fertility decreases as well. So middle adulthood is really kind of all about this decline in sexual interest, activity, and fertility. Women enter menopause around age 50. So once they enter menopause, they can no longer have children. That's the halt of their reproductive ability. And men can technically have children all the way up till the day they die. However, in middle adulthood, their sperm count, testosterone level, and speed of erection and ejaculation decline. So it's still possible for a man to have children this late, but it becomes less and less likely because of this decline in fertility for both men and women. But for women, it's a little more definitive. They stop being able to reproduce altogether. And then, like I said, sexual activity is going to lessen in this period too. Late adulthood. Basically, everything else declines. Visual sharpness, distance perception, adaptation to light level changes, muscle strength, reaction time, stamina, smell, hearing, sensations. So basically in this stage, your senses are really what declines here. Your smell, your hearing, your vision, all those sorts of things. The eye's pupil also shrinks, which is interesting. The lens becomes less transparent, makes it more difficult to see, really. And then this is so important and gets asked about all the time. When you get into late adulthood, your immune system weakens. The body becomes more susceptible to cancer and pneumonia. However, older adults are less likely to catch the common cold or flu. So even though the immune system is weakening really to new illnesses that you can become more and more susceptible to. So cancer, pneumonia, stuff like that. But the stuff that, has been around for a long time, the cold and flu, older people are actually less likely to catch the cold or flu than younger people. And this is because, they've seen so many different strains of cold and flu throughout their whole life that they've built up antibodies against them. So be aware that the immune system weakens and you become more susceptible to new illnesses, but the common cold and flu and stuff like that, you actually are less likely to catch as you get older. Okay, almost there. When it comes to memory, older adults can more easily recall landmark memories from their teens and 20s. Landmark memories are just really influential memories, especially ones that are tied to emotion. So like remembering your wedding day or your graduation, very specific sort of flashbulb memories. With age, we see a decline in recall memory, but not in recognition memory. We're going to get to chapter 8 by the end of this, and we'll have a little more understanding of recall versus recognition. But recall is essentially like fill in the blank memory. Like I give you a prompt and you need to pull the information out of your head. Whereas recognition is much like a multiple choice test. I'm giving you all of the information. You just have to recognize the correct answer. So as people get older, their recall becomes less and less accurate, but their recognition tends to stay constant. And then prospective memory, which is remembering to do things in the future, tends to decline with age as well, unless people leave themselves cues or hints, like notes written to themselves on their cabinet or fridge or something like that. Okay, cross-sectional versus longitudinal study. You want to know the difference between these. So both of them have the same goal of trying to assess developmental changes over time. And so with a cross-sectional study, I would pick different sections, different groups of people to analyze against each other, cross-sectional study, cross-referencing these individuals from different sections of their lives. So we would pull, let's say, 50 people between the ages of 10 and 15, and 50 people between 15 and 20, and then 50 between 20 and 25, 25 and 30, 30 and 35, all the way up to, let's say 85 to 90, for example. So that's a cross-sectional study. I am bringing in all sorts of different people who are all at different ages at the same point of time. So they're all at different ages, but it's all happening right now. I'm gathering all of these people at the same time in history, I suppose. And so, this is good because it's easily accessible. I can find, plenty of people in every single age group who are probably willing to do my study of some sort. But the problem is there can be characteristic differences between these people. People who are now 80 years old compared to people who are right now 15. They had entirely different life experiences. The people who are 80 now never had cell phones growing up. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have, all sorts of these things. And so there's potential confounding variables in a cross-sectional study because these people did not have the same exposure or life experience as the other people did. So what tends to actually kind of fix that problem is called a longitudinal study. So a longitudinal study would take a bunch of people at birth and study them all the way through their whole life. Now the issue with the longitudinal study is it's sort of impractical and it takes forever to do. If I do a cross-sectional study, I can get my information right now, but we've got confounding variables. If I do a longitudinal study, well, I may die before I ever see the results, but at least we're comparing apples to apples. All of those people are growing up in the same world as each other, right? In the same time period. So just be aware of how those differ and, the pros and cons of each, essentially. Neurocognitive disorders are disorders that are marked by cognitive deficits. This is usually related to Alzheimer's, other brain injuries or diseases, or substance abuse. Alcohol is a really big one. Alcohol leads to Korsakoff's syndrome, which is essentially acquired Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's that would be preventable. But essentially long-term alcohol use just destroys your memory. It does. And it can kind of lead to Korsakoff's syndrome is something like amnesia or Alzheimer's a little bit. And then Alzheimer's disease, I'm sure we know about this, a neurocognitive disorder where memory and other cognitive abilities progressively decline. So Alzheimer's in that sense is terminal in that it won't get better or even level off without treatment. It will just continue to get progressively worse. Okay. The social clock is just kind of this idea that everyone has some sort of socially influenced idea of around when they should meet certain milestones. So when they should be married, when they should have children, when they should retire. Maybe the idea is marriage should happen, let's say somewhere between 24 and 35 or something along those lines. Parenthood, people should start having kids by 26 to 32, or it's just kind of this like socially or culturally preferred timing of these events. Everyone is supposed to retire at about 60, right? So the social clock, it's completely like nurture. It's completely culturally, environmentally influenced. It's just when, your culture of people thinks is the appropriate time to do these milestone events. Okay, these are just some really interesting facts about relationship longevity and divorce. So relationships that are sealed with commitment, whether that's a straight or a gay relationship, are more likely to last. And in psychology, we call that vow power. And really what that is essentially just this idea that if you make a commitment to something, it affects you psychologically and you feel the need to honor a commitment that you've made. So if you seal a relationship with a commitment, you get married, that's actually more likely to last than relationships where people are not getting married. Even if they're both happy with not getting married, they don't want to. It's still less likely to last than a couple who has decided to get married. Couples who are well educated and marry after 20 are less likely to divorce. So really that kind of just goes along with maturity and understanding. If you have a good grasp of who you are and a good grasp of, what's sort of appropriate and what you want and what you need, and you don't just rush into marriage, then, you're less likely to divorce than people who are not so well educated. Maybe they marry because it's economically beneficial to them, not really for love, or maybe they're rushing into getting married and they don't really even know what love is, right? So if you're well educated and you marry later, after 20, you're less likely to divorce than people who are non-educated and marry before 20. Now this one's interesting. You'd probably think that this was the opposite way around, but couples who live together before they're married actually tend to divorce more than couples who don't live together before marriage. And I really am not entirely sure why that is, but the going idea is that it might have something to do kind of with that first point about commitment, where when people live together, they sort of, they are making a commitment to each other in one way or another, but it's not being sealed with that like official signing of a document type situation. And so people get maybe stuck in dysfunctional patterns of living together without actually pursuing marriage. And then, they're already living together. And so now they're thinking, well, I've invested so much time into living with this person. I guess I better just marry them. That seems like the next step or something. And so maybe you end up getting married to someone that you shouldn't be marrying, right? And then a 5-to-1 ratio of positive to negative interactions predicts marital happiness. So for every one thing you do to upset your partner, you better do 5 things to make it up to them, right? And that doesn't mean you hurt someone and then you say 5 nice things. Oh, you look beautiful. I love you. Whatever, right? That it's not like that, but it's just all that we're saying here is in experiments where we've brought in couples and observed how they interacted with each other, people who at least had a 5-to-1 ratio of positive to negative interactions were the most happy in their marriages compared to people who had a ratio that was less desirable. They had more negative interactions and less positive interactions. They were the most unhappy. Okay? When it comes to well-being across the lifespan, people are actually much more likely to regret the things that they didn't do, not regret the things that they did do. So, if you're wondering, should I do it or not? Well, you better do it because you'll probably regret it more if you don't. I don't really mean that in every circumstance, of course, but, something to consider. People actually regret the what ifs more than they regret the actual mistakes. From adolescence to middle adulthood, people strengthen their sense of identity, confidence, and self-esteem. In later adulthood, their income drops, those opportunities go away, the body deteriorates, recall fades, energy is lost, important people are lost, and death looms in the future. Wow, how optimistic. However, older adults are actually not significantly less happy than younger people. Their self-esteem stays relatively stable, and this is something that I want you to write down on your worksheet, is that our brain is actually wired to correct for the disappointments of growing older. Our brain is wired to correct for the disappointments of growing older. Our brain helps us to adapt and continue to feel a sense of well-being over time. So what we mean by this is, your brain actually adjusts the chemicals that are being produced and the amounts they're being produced in to make it so that positive feelings are even more positive and negative feelings are more neutral. So older people have better emotional control because of this change in their brain chemistry. But, of course, older adults have fewer social interactions, and so they're more lonely, they're more isolated, particularly once loved ones start passing away and spouses. And then this is another way where your brain is correcting for the disappointments of growing older. Your amygdala responses to negative events decrease, and so do your brainwave reactions to negative events. So this is, again, like I was saying, those negative feelings become more neutral. This is why. Your amygdala is not responding with as much intensity to negative events, and neither are your brain waves. They just kind of make negative events into a neutral instead of making them absolutely devastating. And so well-being is overall resilient throughout life. We think, certainly it has to be sad and disappointing to get older, but the science really shows that well-being's pretty resilient. Well-being is pretty stable across the lifespan. All right, last thing. These are just some misconceptions about loss and about grieving that we are going to correct. So the first misconception is that terminally ill people go through these stages of grief. That's the first misconception, that there are stages of grief that people go through in a predictable manner. So you might have heard of DABDA before. That would be denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. So that's the misconception, is we think that people go through these stages one by one, and that's how they process emotions, and that's how it is for everybody. Everyone's in denial, then everyone gets angry, then everyone bargains, then everyone gets depressed, and then everyone accepts what has happened to them. That's not true. Terminally ill people don't go through the same predictable stages. Instead, it tends to be that you bounce around, and that's true with whether it's terminal illness or just processing any grief. You might be in denial at first, and then you might be depressed before you get angry, and you might bargain before you are in denial. Bargaining might be a part of denial even, So it's not that it goes DABDA, it's just, you bounce around between all of these feelings, but at the end of it, you should result in acceptance of what has happened. So the A should come last. A second A, that is, the acceptance A. Here is another misconception, is we tend to think that people who express their grief really strongly from the start get through it more quickly. Well, that's just not true. No matter the intensity of how you express your grief, it really has no effect on how long it takes you to process the grief. So we kind of have this catharsis hypothesis that, if people get it out, then it somehow goes away or doesn't affect them as much. And that's just not true. Whether you express grief really strongly from the start or only moderately strongly, it doesn't make you get through it any more quickly or any less quickly. But trying to avoid processing grief can actually prolong it. So it's best to just face this stuff head on and try to work through it. And then the final misconception is that therapy and self-help groups are going to decrease the length of your grieving process. It's not true. Therapy and self-help groups do offer support, But for an individual who is a part of one of those groups, their grief process is the same length as someone who's not part of that process or part of that group. So it really, not to say that therapy and self-help groups are a bad idea. Maybe they help you process it better, or react to these situations better, but it doesn't shorten the period in which you feel your grief. So, not to say it's completely useless, but it's just not going to make you get through the grieving process any quicker. And that's that. Make sure to turn in that pre-session worksheet with all of your little things highlighted. Please highlight them for me. That would be so kind. But yeah, and then I will see y'all for our live Zoom SI.